Hi my dear students, welcome back to the second part of this video lesson on Mending Wall by Robert Frost. Hope you remember what we discussed in the first part of this lesson. We discussed how the poem presents a conflict between the traditional perspective, the traditional approach that good fences make good neighbors, and the modern perspective that all such barriers are unnatural and unnecessary. In fact, the poem presents an argument between the poet and his neighbor. Here the poet represents the modern outlook, whereas his neighbor represents the traditional outlook. Dear children, now we are going to take up the remaining part of the poem. But before we do that, I would like you to listen to the poem once again. And this time you are going to listen to the poet himself. You are now going to listen to Robert Frost reading his own poem, Mending Wall. Once you do that, we'll be coming back to discuss the remaining part of the poem.
Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that sends the frozen groundswell under it and spills the upper boulders in the sun and makes gaps even two can pass abreast. The work of hunters is another thing. I have come after them and made repair where they have left not one stone on a stone, but they would have the rabbit out of hiding to please the yelping dogs. The gaps I mean, no one has seen them made or heard them made, but at spring mending time we find them there. I let my neighbor know beyond the hill, and on a day we meet to walk the line and set the wall between us once again. We keep the wall between us as we go. To each the boulders that have fallen to each, and some are lows and some so nearly balls we have to use a spell to make them balance. Stay where you are until our backs are turned. We wear our fingers rough with handling them. Oh, just another kind of outdoor game, one on the side. It comes to little more there where it is. We do not need the wall. He is all pine, and I am apple orchard. My apple trees will never get across and eat the cones on these pines, I tell him. He only says, good fences make good neighbors. Spring is the mischief in me, and I wonder if I could put a notion in his head. Why do they make good neighbors? Isn't it where there are cows? But here there are no cows. Before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offense. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that wants it done. I could say elves to him, but it's not elves exactly, and I'd rather he said it for himself. I see him there, bringing a stone grasped firmly by the top in each hand, like an old stone savage armed. He moves in darkness, as it seems to me, not of woods only, in the shade of trees. He will not go behind his father's saying, and he likes having thought of it so well, he says again, good fences make good neighbors.
Dear children, you have just listened to the voice of Robert Frost in the backdrop of a very important event in world history. Do you know what that event is? It is the construction of Berlin Wall, partitioning the city of Berlin. And those visuals clearly convey how disastrous a wall could be. And those visuals convey how a wall could not only divide the land, but hearts as well. And this wall, Berlin Wall, was constructed in the year 1961 by East Germany, which was under Russian control at that time. And the very next year in 1962, the poet made a trip to Russia. It was an official trip, and during that trip, he recited this poem at a public function, Mending Wall. And there were reports at that time that he was protesting against the construction of this wall, the Berlin Wall. So what we see here is, this poem has a universal appeal. It is true for all ages. We see the poem was written in 1914, but it was relevant in 1962, and it is relevant even today. Even in this 21st century, we come across a lot of such man-made barriers that cause unnecessary division in the society. And the question the poem raises before us is, do we need such walls? Do such walls help us live a peaceful, harmonious life? So dear children, in the last part of the poem, the first few lines of the poem, we read about how nature expresses her resentment, her protest against man-made walls. The poet says some invisible force in nature damages a wall every winter season. And the poet also says how hunters damage the wall to get the rabbits out of hiding. So let us now move on to the next few lines of the poem. You please listen to the next few lines of the poem. You could also read it on the screen, and I'll be coming back with a few questions for a detailed discussion on those lines.
I let my neighbour know beyond the hill, and on a day we meet to walk the line and set the wall between us once again. We keep the wall between us as we go. To each the boulders that have fallen to each, and some are loaves, and some so nearly balls, we have to use a spell to make them balance. Stay where you are until our backs are turned. We wear our fingers rough with handling them.
Dear children, in this part of the poem, the poet tells us how he repairs the wall along with his neighbor. He tells us about the difficulties they face in balancing those stones. Now let us discuss a few questions. The first question you take, who takes the initiative to repair the wall? And what does this show about his character, his attitude? Who takes the initiative? Is it the neighbor who takes the initiative? No. It is the poet himself who takes the initiative. It is the poet who goes to the neighbor, who lives beyond the hill, and tells him there are gaps in the wall. And they both fix a date. And on that day, they both walk along the boundary line. And they repair the wall wherever there are damages. So what does this show about his character, his attitude? Though he doesn't like walls, though he says nature doesn't love walls, he still takes the initiative to repair the wall. It shows the inner conflict within the poet's mind. Though he is progressive in his outlook, though he doesn't like walls, he still follows the traditions. Now it has become a habit for him to repair the wall every spring season. So he is progressive in outlook. He still follows traditional practices. That is the conflict we all have in our minds. Though we are liberal, we question age-old practices, we still follow such practices. So this contradiction we find in the poet's character. He is a liberal as well as a traditionalist at the same time. So let us go to the next question here. Why do they face difficulty in balancing those stones? Why do they face difficulty in putting those boulders back in place? They face difficulty because those stones are of a different size and shape. The poet says some are loaves and some are balls. Loaves means loaf of bread, flat shaped. And the poet says the stones are not even in their size and shape. Some are flat shaped, some are ball shaped or spherical. So this is why they find it difficult to balance the stones. And how do they manage to balance those stones finally? Finally, they had to use a spell, a magic spell, to balance those stones. And the last question, when the poet says, stay where you are until our backs are turned. Who are addressed here? Who are addressed in this line? Stay where you are until our backs are turned. Who are addressed here? And what does it show about the speaker's attitude? What does it show about the speaker's attitude? Who are addressed here? And what does it show about the speaker's attitude? The stones are addressed here. The boulders are addressed here. And who are the speakers? The poet and his neighbor. And what does it show about the speaker's attitude? It shows that they are not serious about what they are doing. They know that they are just completing a formality, fulfilling a formality. They know about the futility of what they are doing. Still, they are doing it just out of habit. They just follow it as a part of their annual routine. They don't think they are doing something very serious. And they don't mind even if the wall collapses the very next moment. So they ask the boulders, please stay there just for a few minutes at least until our backs are turned. So the attitude, the lack of seriousness is what we find here. They are not serious about what they are doing. So children, we have discussed all the questions there. Now I would like you to go to the next part of the poem. You read the next part of the poem, and then I'll be coming back with a few more questions for a detailed discussion.
Oh, just another kind of outdoor game, one on a side. It comes to little more. He is all pine, and I am apple orchard. My apple trees will never get across and eat the cones under his pines, I tell him. He only says, good fences make good neighbours.
This part of the poem conveys the futility of this activity. The poet tries to convey that repairing the wall doesn't serve any practical purpose. So let us move on to the first question here. What is repairing the wall compared to, and what does it imply? What is that activity compared to, and what does that comparison imply? Repairing the wall here is compared to an outdoor game. And what does it imply? It implies that it's a futile activity. It doesn't serve any practical purpose. So it's a pleasurable activity, just like an outdoor game. And it doesn't bring about any other results rather than giving the doer some pleasure. So it is compared to an outdoor game. In two ways, it's like an outdoor game. One is it doesn't serve any purpose. Secondly, it is like in an outdoor game, the poet and his neighbor are standing on either side of the wall. In an outdoor game, two people stand on either side of a net and play the game. Just like that, here the poet and his neighbor are standing on either side of the wall and mending the wall. So through this comparison, the poet tries to convey that it's a futile activity. It doesn't bring about any desirable result. Okay, now go on to the second question. Why does the poet feel there is no need of a wall between their farms? Why does the poet feel there is no need of a wall between their farms? So the poet thinks there's no need of a wall between their farms because they have different crops. The poet has apple orchard, his neighbor has pine trees. And the poet humorously says that his apple trees will never get across to the other farm and eat the cones under his pines. So he says, since they both have different crops, there is no chance of their crops getting mixed up, and there is no chance of any dispute between the two of them, the neighbor and the poet. So there is no need of any wall. And he says the wall in that case doesn't serve any purpose since they both have different crops. Now go on to the third question. What does a neighbor mean when he says good fences make good neighbors? The neighbor keeps on repeating this line. This is an old proverb. Good fences make good neighbors. What does he mean by this? When the neighbor says this, he means when there is a fence between two neighbors, it would prevent disputes and it would help them live a peaceful, healthy life. So this is the traditional perspective, the traditional concept. The traditional concept is that there should always be a healthy distance between people so that there are no quarrels, there are no disputes between them. Whereas the modern concept is that, the modern perspective is that any kind of such barrier between people is unhealthy. There should be freedom to mingle freely with each other so that we can have a mutual cooperation. So modern concept is that any such wall is a hindrance on our way to cooperating with each other, on our way to helping each other. But here, the neighbor, being a traditionalist, he believes that good fences make good neighbors. And he's not ready to change his attitude. He's not ready to reform himself. He keeps on repeating this. Okay, now let us move on to the next part of the poem. The next few lines of the poem. You read the next few lines of the poem. I'll be coming back with a few more questions like this, and we'll have a detailed discussion.
Spring is the mischief in me, and I wonder if I could put a notion in his head. Why do they make good neighbours? Isn't it where there are cows? But here there are no cows. Before I built a wall, I'd asked to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offence.
The argument between the poet and his neighbor continues in this part of the poem as well. The poet in every way tries to convince his neighbor that there's no need of a wall between their farms. So take the question number 1. What notion would the poet try to put in his neighbor's head? To put a notion in someone's head means to give a piece of advice to someone. What advice the poet would like to give his neighbor? What notion he would like to put in his neighbor's head? He would like to advise his neighbor that there was no need of a wall between their farms because they both didn't have cows. If they had cows, it would make some sense. Since they both don't have cows, there's no need of a wall between their farms because only when there are cows, they would enter each other's farms and destroy crops. So this notion he would like to put in his neighbor's head. So take the second question here. What would the poet like to know before he built a wall? What would the poet like to know before he built a wall? So the poet says before he built a wall, he would like to know certain things. What are they? He would like to know what he was walling in and walling out. And he would like to know who he would like to give offense. So what does the poet mean when he says that he would like to know what he was walling in and walling out? So when you build a wall, you have two purposes in mind. A wall serves two purposes. One is to protect or wall in the people within the territory. So you want to protect the people, the animals who live within the territory. That is one purpose of a wall. The other one is to keep away the outsiders. To keep away the people who live outside the territory. So you build a wall to serve two purposes. One is to wall in certain people, and the second is to wall out certain others. So he says before he would build a wall, he would like to know who he was walling in, who he was protecting, and who he was walling out, who he was keeping away. Then he also says he would like to know who he was like to give offense. In building a wall, naturally you offend someone because a wall is a sign of mistrust. When you build a wall, you are expressing your mistrust, lack of faith in the other person. So he would like to know who he was like to give offense. So the poet would like to know these two things before he built a wall. He would like to know who he was walling in or who he was walling out. And he would also like to know who he was like to give offense. So dear children, I'm sure you are very clear with these, the idea conveyed here. And I would like you to read the last part of the poem now, and then I'll be coming back with some more questions for a detailed discussion.
Something there is that doesn't love a wall that wants it down. I could say elves to him. But it's not elves exactly, and I'd rather he said it for himself. I see him there, bringing a stone grasped firmly by the top, in each hand, like an old stone savage armed. He moves in darkness, as it seems to me, not of woods only in the shade of trees. He will not go behind his father's saying, and he likes, having thought of it so well, he says again, good fences make good neighbours.
Dear children, we have come to the end of that poem. Now, in that last part of the poem, we find the poet making some striking comparisons. He compares his neighbor to a stone savage armed, because his neighbor is not ready to deviate from the path laid down by his forefathers. He still follows the words of his forefathers blindly. So the poet here makes a very apt comparison. He compares his neighbor to a stone savage, because the neighbor feels, the poet feels, his neighbor still lives in Stone Age. So let us discuss a few questions here. The first question is, how does the poet create mystery? How does the poet create mystery here? In the first 2-3 lines, you find the poet creating mystery. How does he create mystery? In the first line itself, you find the poet repeating that first line of the poem, something there is that doesn't love a ball. So it creates mystery. Some invisible force in nature doesn't like walls. And in the next 2-3 lines he says, he feels it could be elves. Elves are supernatural beings, fairies with pointed ears. You could see an image here on the screen. So he feels it could be elves. And in the very next line he says, no, it's not elves exactly. He says he would rather his neighbor found out on his own. So this is how he creates a mystery in the first 3 lines. He says there is something in nature that doesn't love war. And then he says it could be elves, and in the very next line he says it's not elves exactly. Oh, now take the second question here. What is the neighbor compared to and why? What is his neighbor compared to and why? His neighbor is compared to a stone savage. And why the poet makes this comparison? He makes this comparison for 2 reasons. One is the neighbor now looks like a stone savage as he is bringing a stone in his hands. So in appearance he looks like a stone savage. The more important reason is that he still lives in a Stone Age. He behaves like a Stone Age man. He still follows the age-old traditions set by his forefathers. He is not ready to deviate from the path of his forefathers. He is not ready to reform himself. So this is why the poet compares the neighbor to a stone savage armed. Now come to the third question here. What does darkness refer to here? What does darkness refer to? The poet says his neighbor is moving darkness. It's not darkness of the woods and the shade of trees alone. But he says, he moves in darkness as it seems to me. Not of woods only and the shade of trees. He means his neighbor is moving in darkness of ignorance also. Okay, already he is standing in the dark under the shade of trees. That way he is standing in darkness. But at the same time, he is standing in the darkness of ignorance. That is what he means there. Again, he condemns his neighbor's attitude, his traditional attitude. He says his neighbor is still living in darkness, in the darkness of ignorance. Now take the next question here. Is the neighbor ready to change his mind? Why? Is his neighbor ready to change his attitude? In the last line, he says again, good fences make good neighbors. And he says this after much thought. After much thought, he repeats, good fences make good neighbors. It shows that he is not willing to reform himself. He is not ready to change himself. He is not ready to deviate from the path of his forefathers. He still clings to those age-old practices, the traditions set by his forefathers. So it shows he is rooted in traditions. He is not willing to accept the changes. So, dear children, I hope you have understood the whole poem. Okay, we have had a very detailed discussion on the poem, and this poem presents a conflict between 2 different attitudes, 2 different perspectives. One is the traditional perspective represented by the neighbor, and the other one, the modern perspective represented by the poet. But the poet doesn't say one is right or the other one is right. He leaves it to the readers to decide whether we should have walls. he raises this question before us. He puts this question before us. He asks this question, do we need walls? And do walls help us live a harmonious, peaceful life? So we have to find an answer for that. So dear children, we have come to the end of it. We'll wind it up here, and I would be giving you some assignment in the days to come. Goodbye.